Hello and welcome. This is Roar of Love, and I'm Heléna Kate, and we are here to step into something perhaps a bit tender, but undeniably real. So today's conversation is about the strength of softness, or how vulnerability, which we're so often taught to fear and to hide, or to armor against, and how it's not our weakness, but it could potentially be our gateway, our bridge, a quiet doorway through which the truth can walk. And so we live in a world that glorifies power and performance and certainty. But what if actually a more radical thing we could do is just tell the truth of how we feel? What if softness is what lets love in? What if softness is what lets God in? So today we're going to walk through that doorway, contemplate vulnerability and its role in our lives, see if there's any adjustments that we'd like to make in relationship to this force in our lives. So there's a kind of a cultural myth of strength. We're taught, especially in the Western world, that strength looks like independence, like pushing through, knowing the answers, staying in control. And we're praised for having everything together, for being unshakable. But behind this image, how often are people bracing, numbing, and pretending? It's one thing, it's great to be strong. Strength is a beautiful attribute. And vulnerability doesn't imply that there isn't strength. It's actually just a different face of strength. But we want to be aware of when we're losing sight of our truth through performance in a certain way. So this isn't saying that we should fall apart in every moment, right? That we want to become kind of messy or chaotic. But let's consider about an option, a way of being deeply vulnerable and incredibly strong at the same time, so that we can receive the benefits of both of those things. And vulnerability in its true form can actually teach us much about this different type of strength. Because vulnerability is sometimes truth, right? We are vulnerable enough to bring through what is true. It can be the kind of truth that transforms, right? And it isn't necessarily loud. It might not look as confident. It might tremble. It might be said with tears. It might come with silence. It could come in just a plain way. It doesn't necessarily need to come with intense emotion, but it mostly comes when we stop pretending and we just allow our truth to be seen. So vulnerability is really about not pretending and allowing our truth to be seen. So I have personally learned a lot about this in my life, and it never ceases to teach me, and that there are new levels to vulnerability, because I learned in life to protect my heart at all cost. So it wasn't that I didn't love, it wasn't that I wasn't open in my own way. Some people would think that I was open, some people think that I wasn't. It's not so much about what people saw or perceived, but I know that the truth is that I had closed myself off, that there were things that were hiding, that I was unwilling to share. And I might justify or rationalize that, but that's still what's happening. There's an unwillingness to share from this place of deep truth for various different reasons. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but some of them are to protect us from certain things, right? So many of us are hiding in this way. And when we're hiding in this way, we're not really living. So vulnerability becomes a key, something that is essential to our being able to live in the fullness of our life. And so often people think of vulnerability as like shame or weakness, but what if instead it is actually courageousness, right? So it's courageousness, it's strength. It's actually a declaration that we cannot be tamed, that will allow what is real and true to speak through us, and that we won't hold back from any kind of exclamation, expression of this kind. And so what if we were to put down the fear that we would be too much or not enough, or just let ourselves be as we are in a particular moment, and just let ourselves be as we are in a particular moment? What might happen in our lives? What might change in our lives? Think of what might change in your relationships with more willingness to be honest, authentic, and vulnerable. Right? Brené Brown's work touches on this so much. As she highlights the importance of vulnerability, she really revolutionized our understanding of vulnerability. So what if strength isn't about what you carry, right? But it's actually sometimes about what you're willing to put down, or what you're willing to honor and stand for. And that is the beautiful truth of your honest self, lived with vulnerability. We all aspire for this in some way. We all want to have more of this openness in our lives, and also fear it in some ways, because most people have experienced some kind of painful experience at the hands of others, intentional or unintentional. And so there's often some kind of a fear that is here, that is, that stops people from really moving into vulnerability. But before we dive more into that, let's take a look at what vulnerability really is, right? Because as I've said, it's not oversharing. It's not collapsing into chaos. Right? It's not that. It's not like making sure that every last detail of what it is that we think or feel is shared with others. But it is very simply our truth without defense. So our truth without defense. And can we live in a way that we are holding our truth without defense? So instead of thinking about it as, oh, I've expressed a weakness, a pain, or a need, right? But it's like, really, what is true on the inside, regardless of what it is? Because sometimes it isn't about the difficulty in expressing the pain, it's a difficulty in expressing some other type of truth. If we think about the vulnerability of love, we know that sometimes it's very difficult to confidently express love, because of fear. So vulnerability in its components is emotional exposure, right? Or exposure in general, allowing ourselves to be seen in all the ways that we can possibly be seen. It has a component of uncertainty to it. So stepping into the moment without guarantees of outcome, right? That's what we think of as vulnerable, right? That there's a risk, there's the possibility of rejection, misunderstanding, or pain, right? So this vulnerability is like, it comes with uncertainty and risk. We can't have vulnerability without it. And it has honesty. So it's telling the truth about how we feel, right? What's going on inside, what we're perceiving. That's just as vulnerable. What we're perceiving is just as vulnerable as what we feel. So oftentimes, again, vulnerability focuses around the people's feelings and the expression of feelings. And that's important because many people don't express their feelings. But vulnerability is really expressing any aspect of ourself. especially the ones that we feel uncertain about or feel risky. Like a lot of times when people start living their passion more in the world, being more on purpose, they feel very vulnerable about stepping out into the world in that way. That is a powerful type of vulnerability, even though it may or may not be the emotion that is leading that is like the person needs to express their emotion. It's just they're just expressing themselves in a world that may not accept them. So there are different types of vulnerability, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. Emotional vulnerability, when we let someone see our emotions or grief or joy. Relational vulnerability, when we reveal the truth, a truth that risks rejection. Spiritual vulnerability, when we surrender, we say, I don't know, but I'm listening. I'm willing to move beyond what it is that I know. And when it really comes down to it, vulnerability is a bridge. It brings us closer to one another, closer to ourselves, closer to the divine. Because there is a permeability, an openness, a truthfulness, and that is where God lives, because God loves the flow of love. So we learn through vulnerability and through meeting each other in this place how to be a greater expression of divine love. And when we look at it that way, it becomes different. It's not about being like leaving ourselves open to problem or difficulty or things that we shouldn't allow in. It's not like that. It is about having a degree of presence, of softness, of, like I said, allowing what is true to work through us. And in order to do that, we need to be willing to accept every part of ourselves. And that can be very challenging. And that's often what makes relationships so challenging, is because they start to push up on the parts of ourselves that we haven't accepted. And in that lack of acceptance, that's the place that usually we harden, and we're unable to be in like loving accord with another. So when we live vulnerability, our body softens and expands. Our whole being, our energy softens and expands. There's more light, and so sometimes there can be some tension as we work through some of our fears, but ultimately it is a softening. It moves from this place of like what needs to be said from the mental into the heart of just the deepest truth, and just stating the deepest truth. And that the idea that vulnerability needs to be unstable or chaotic or desperate is erroneous. It can be quiet, steady, intentional. It can sing our heart's truth, regardless of what the moment is. So we get to share in this way. Brene Brown said, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. And vulnerability requires softness. It requires a willingness. And like I said, it requires a deep acceptance of ourselves, a willingness to be with and live that truth. So how do we practice this softness? How do we move ourselves into vulnerability? And also, one of the things is that life in general, our day-to-day life, often doesn't encourage vulnerability. It often encourages that performance. And so we have to learn how to right ourselves, to balance ourselves in this overall process. And part of that is by welcoming in softness, slowing down, noticing where we're bracing, noticing where there's tension, noticing where there's pretending, and where we're wearing armor. So if we ask ourselves, how am I bracing, tightening, or pretending? Where am I wearing armor that no longer serves me? Right? We start to see into the places that are, unwilling to be vulnerable, unwilling to open more. So this softness begins with presence. Right? And presence can be increased by doing a morning ritual, by writing in your journal, by taking time to yourself, sitting in silence, just letting, just listening to what's going on inside. And it helps us develop our presence. And then in our presence, because we have to know what's going on inside in order to share what's going on inside. So the next piece is that then we can start to have the courage to share what it is that's going on inside of us. And where we want to, where it serves us. But sometimes there's a bit of a face of vulnerability that just is about not hiding. And it doesn't necessarily need to be explicit. It can just be a place of being willing to be seen. So we can ask these questions, or you can ask these questions of yourself to help you move into a greater space of vulnerability. And one is, where in my life am I afraid to be seen? So where in my life am I afraid to be seen? What part of my truth have I hidden? What part of my truth have I hidden? And who do I become when I allow softness? Who do I become when I allow softness? Remember, softness doesn't mean boundaryless. In fact, it's the opposite. When we're soft, we are in deep contact with our inner world. And that allows us to choose what to let in, what to hold, and what to release. So softness is actually clarity and not chaos. So when we live from softness, just imagine what might become possible. We become more real, and that realness is magnetic. It invites others in the same direction. So relationships deepen, creativity blooms, leadership shifts from control to compassion. Spiritual connection becomes embodied and alive. We stop performing, we start communing, connecting. A whole new world opens up as a result of our willingness to just be with the truth of who we are and allow that the space to exist and to be expressed. So the more we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, the more resilient we actually become. Right? Not because life gets easier, but basically because we stop abandoning ourselves. Right? This is a very important point. So our resiliency comes from that place of deep acceptance inside that then allows us to be vulnerable, because we know that whatever slings and arrows that we receive from the outside, cannot really damage, shake this love of self and this willingness to stay with ourselves and on our own side. So the vulnerability says, I trust that this truth is enough. And our softness says, I don't need to fight to be worthy. I already am. And that is an incredibly powerful strength. And so in each of our moments of the day, we have an opportunity to experiment with vulnerability, to be in a greater place of truthfulness with ourselves and with the world. And when we do that, we start to build bridges, like emotional bridges, spiritual bridges, relational bridges. We start to build something truly new out of this place of vulnerability, this willingness to connect, this willingness to be in truth. And we don't so much have to worry about the places of judgment external to us, because they can fall away. It's like if something is not in accord with your truth, then it won't have any space to live in and around you. So by being more completely in our truth, we eliminate certain types of issues, and we become clearer on how to take care of ourselves around ones that maybe we are not so able to eliminate. Also, when we allow ourselves to be seen in this way, right, we become more magnetic, because people are looking and longing for the truth. They're looking and longing for an opportunity to be able to just be themselves. They're looking and longing for like that breath of fresh air. That seems, sometimes people don't experience it for large stretches of their life, or they never experience it in their life. And so when they know, finally I can let this down and I can be in the truth of who I am, some really, really powerful things can happen. Another function of vulnerability is creativity. So by being more truthful and in flow, our inner critic will soften, right? And we are able to move more into truthful expression, which naturally has an impact on our ability to create. So the more that we're in truthfulness, the more that we're able to open up, create, manifest, make what we want to make happen in the world. And the last piece I'll add about vulnerability before I transition to some questions is about control. So when we stop controlling the outcome in our life, which is a lot of what happens when we're not in vulnerability. So when we're in a place of holding or tension or concealing or whatever we might do that is not being in our truth and being in our vulnerability, then when we stop controlling the outcome, so whenever we let go of this holding and stop controlling the outcome, naturally what happens
is that a deeper truth emerges. And that this actually helps to create a strength inside of us. And so we let go. I let go of another person's opinion, what they might think or feel, how they might translate what it is that I'm saying, thinking, doing, or being. I let go of that. I let go of controlling how somebody's going to perceive me because I do or don't do something. And I allow, through this letting go, for the deeper truth of what's there to emerge. And that is something that I can hold, or that will strengthen me. Because oftentimes when we're reaching outside of ourselves for something, we're trying to manipulate or change an outcome, then we are doing that because we fear our own weakness. We fear what we're not. We fear our limitation. And or we fear some aspect of our being that we haven't accepted. And so then we try to manage how that interfaces with the world. And well, but when we let that down, we get to start to see how those true gifts come through. What is that deeper truth? What is it that I really am? So we stop trying to suppress or control either inside or outside of ourselves and allow this deeper truth to emerge. That deeper truth has its resiliency and strength to it. So it happens a different way. Instead of through management and control, it's through actually acceptance and vulnerability. And all of this, basically, all of this helps with healing. So we heal better in honest spaces, in spaces where we can be vulnerable. We heal, whether that's with ourselves or with someone else. The healing comes from knowing that there is this opening towards what is really true. So healing comes from knowing that there's this opening to what is really true, because that's the pathway of light and love that is opening up when it's like we allow that truthful space to be, right? There is more light and love in that space, and that's another way that we can look at and understand healing. So overall reframing the idea that vulnerability is weakness or chaos or emotional discord or something like that, and recognizing that it's really allowing the truth of who we are to come forward. And when it's hard to do, and we make ourselves vulnerable, we allow ourselves to be seen. And we're able in that moment to do that actually because we have enough self-acceptance inside. And then, so we're able to bring kind of the full expression of who we are out. And when we think about this, if you think about somebody who's very rigid and controlling and like their effect on you versus someone who is accepting and loving, right, feels very different. It's kind of how vulnerability functions in our life. So I'm going to answer a few questions. Let's see here. You're always welcome to add questions. Okay, I think this is a good one. How do you distinguish between being vulnerable and feeling exposed or unsafe? So, how do you distinguish between being vulnerable and feeling exposed or unsafe? Right? Because vulnerability is going to bring some kind of risk with it, right? Like that's the nature of it. There's uncertain and there's risk. So, what I always tell people with this is to be vulnerable to the degree that they can hold themselves safely. So, what that means is that if you're going to fall apart as the result of, like, if you are not well received, your vulnerability is not well received, it's going to really mess you up, then that's too far. That is clear. You want to stay at a place where it might shake you a little bit, it might challenge you a little bit, it might stretch you, might cause you to need to accept yourself a little bit more, but that you are able to manage what it is that's going on. And for everyone, that is a different level of what the act is, and then also what the actual experience is. So we find out for ourselves by just saying, okay, this is the amount of instability I can handle in this particular moment. And when we reach the cap of where we're able to be vulnerable without putting ourselves in harm's way, we can use that as an opportunity to reflect on why whatever it is that's coming forward is so vulnerable. Because we can actually eliminate some of the feelings of vulnerability, some of the risk, by becoming more accepting of who we are. That doesn't mean somebody else will accept it. However, that still might hurt, but we're better inside of ourselves. We're more okay with ourselves as we move through that. So we're really just making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And when we're not able to take care of ourselves, we push ourselves too far. That would really be how we're able to then distinguish, how we're able to draw that line. So what messages did you receive about softness or sensitivity growing up? How have those shaped the way that you show up? So, what messages did you receive about softness or sensitivity when growing up? Well, I received the message that they were neither safe nor smart. And really the idea was like you were supposed to kind of like buck up and be able to handle it regardless of what it was that was happening or whether or not you were prepared for it. And I wasn't necessarily in an environment that supported me. So there was like I came to an understanding because of that softness was actually dangerous. And so I spent a good amount of my time trying not to appear soft in any way, shape, or form. And as a means of protection. Over time, that started to shift and change. But it's still a lesson for me. It's still something that I need to shift into, meaning that in areas where I'm really challenged, it's very easy for me to get my back up rather than to remember to go into this place of vulnerability. So I consider vulnerability overall in like what I'm talking about today to be a practice, something that we can continually show up to the process of. to deepen and develop ourselves, and also as a measure to show me where I am and I am not in acceptance of myself. So when I'm unable to be vulnerable, I'm either in a situation where I shouldn't be vulnerable, right? Or I've got something that I need to take a look at. I need to come into greater acceptance of. So my upbringing mostly brings me to a place of compassion for myself and others, in regards to this vulnerability, and also makes me appreciate how much of a strength it really is. It's like I know from the development of it inside of myself what a strength that it is. Oh, here's a good one. Do you experience vulnerability more in solitude or in relationship? Why do you think that is? Now, I want to talk about this as a general topic. So, I mean, I can answer it personally, but overall, like each person would have their own answer to this. And it's worth exploring, because some people are much more comfortable in solitude, and other people are much more comfortable in relationship. That they actually feel highly, I'm a solitude person, they actually feel much more vulnerable when they are in solitude, and much safer, and have an easier time relaxing when in relationship. So why might this be, right? But this is probably because of what someone learns is safe or not safe, and how they've learned to be in relationship with themselves. So when they learn that other people are not safe, right, they're going to most likely be more comfortable with themselves. If they've learned that their inner landscape, they don't know how to process or be with their inner landscape, then they might find solitude difficult. Because that's why a lot of times people go on retreats, or they go into meditation, go into silent meditation or things like that, because that solitude brings us into deeper contact with ourselves. So why we experience vulnerability in one setting or another is worth exploring, and seeing, like, okay, where is it? What are the places that I feel most vulnerable? What are the topics that are most difficult for me to talk about? What are the things that I don't want to share with other people? What are the ways that I hide or manage the way that I'm in the world? Right? We can be like overly polite. We can not show up in our strength. We can do all sorts of things. All of those are pointing towards places where we are less comfortable being in our vulnerability, being vulnerable and accepting who it is that we are. And so then we can start to get to work of like looking at those places and saying, what is it that, like, where do I need to shine love? What do I need to accept? And start that journey, that process of exploring where we have abandoned ourselves, where we are looking to have another person tell us what it is that is right or wrong, or what we feel or shouldn't feel. And when we start to ask these questions, it's in there. You don't think, oh no, I'm very independent. No, I don't do this. And then when we start to ask the questions, it's in there. The places where we compromise, where we don't even know how we feel about who we are or what we've done. And that's all the material that we get to be in right relationship with in ourselves, so that then we can be in that place of soft presence. We can move into the world with vulnerability without it being necessarily even a big deal. And we can have that soft strength and awareness to move through our lives. So I'd like to close today with a blessing. May you allow yourself to soften. May your truth find a safe passage through your voice. May your tears be honored and your silence be sacred, and your honesty be held with reverence. And may you remember, a softness is not a collapse. Vulnerability is not a fragility. They are signs that you are strong, that your heart is open, and that your spirit is alive. This week, I invite you to notice one moment where you could choose softness instead of deflecting or defending or hardening. I invite you to pause, take a breath, speak from your heart, and let it be a new beginning, a new way of connecting, and to see what that creates. As always, you can connect with me on Sacred Lights and helenakate.com. And if today's episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your stories, your reflections, your questions, and all of that may find its way into a future episode, because I love talking with you. So have a great rest of your evening, and thank you for being a part of Roar of Love.